The system behind trucking fleets runs on a number almost nobody outside the industry knows: 71%. That's the average truck utilization rate for the freight industry, meaning nearly a third of the time, an 80,000-pound rig with a six-figure engine is sitting still, earning nothing, while the bills keep running. Every semi you've ever seen on the highway is one link in a system engineered to survive that number, and most operators inside it never do. Here's the contradiction at the center of trucking. It is one of the most essential, recession-resistant industries on Earth. 72.6% of all freight tonnage in the US moves by truck, and the economy physically cannot function without it. And yet, trucking companies fail at a higher rate than almost any other transportation business, with an average annual failure rate north of 3.5%, and thousands of small carriers shutting down every single quarter. An industry the whole economy depends on is somehow one of the hardest ones to survive. Inside. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a trucking fleet actually turns a diesel engine into a profit machine, why the real money in freight almost never touches the person driving the truck, how a single number called the operating ratio decides whether a 100-truck fleet lives or dies, and why some of the largest, most respected carriers in America have collapsed overnight with almost no warning at all. At the bottom of the system sits the owner-operator. One driver, one truck, usually financed for $140,000 to $180,000 on a 5 to 7 year note, running under someone else's authority or their own. Annual revenue for a solid owner-operator lands around $180,000 to $230,000 in gross freight billings, but after fuel, insurance, and truck payments, net income typically settles between $58,000 and $74,000. Before the driver has paid themselves a salary for the 3,000 plus hours a year they spend behind the wheel. One tier up is the small regional fleet, 5 to 25 trucks, usually family-run, with $2.5 million to $9 million in annual revenue, and margins hovering around 4% to 7% if management is disciplined. This is the tier where the math gets unforgiving. A single bad contract or one truck down for repairs can wipe out a month's profit. Above that sits the mid-size regional carrier, 100 to 500 trucks, $40 million to $180 million in revenue, with dedicated compliance departments, in-house maintenance shops, and enough scale to negotiate fuel and insurance. Rates the small operators never see. These fleets run on operating ratios, total operating expenses divided by revenue, that need to stay under roughly 93% just to survive. At the top sits the national mega carrier. Fleets like J.B. Hunt or Schneider running 12,000 to 20,000 trucks, generating $5 billion to $12 billion in annual revenue, with enough freight volume to set market rates rather than take them. And then there's the outlier, the private fleet, where a company like Walmart or PepsiCo runs thousands of trucks not to sell freight capacity, but purely to guarantee its own supply chain never breaks, treating the entire trucking operation as a cost center rather than a business, a fleet that exists to lose money on paper in exchange for control nobody else in the system has. But the numbers on the surface are just the start. The first hidden cost is insurance. A single truck's liability and cargo coverage runs $9,000 to $15,000 a year for a clean safety record, and that number can triple after one serious accident, sometimes pushing small fleets out of business entirely because insurers simply refuse to renew. The second gatekeeper is the FMCSA's compliance framework, the ELD mandate, hours of service rules, and the CSA safety scoring system that quietly ranks every carrier's crash risk. A fleet with a poor safety score doesn't just risk fines, it gets locked out of the best-paying contract freight entirely, because major shippers won't book a carrier with a at-ease bad score, no matter how cheap the rate. And the third, quieter cost is broker dependency. Roughly 35% to 40% of all truckload freight moves through a broker rather than a direct shipper relationship, and brokers routinely take an 18% to 25% cut of the rate before the carrier ever sees a dollar. A toll booth sitting in the middle of a system that looks, from the outside, like just a truck and a highway. So here's the whole system in one sentence. Trucking doesn't make money by moving freight. It makes money by minimizing the miles a truck drives without freight on it. Picture a toy example first. Imagine a truck that costs $1.83 per mile to operate. Fuel, driver pay, maintenance, insurance, and financing all rolled together. And it gets paid $2.40 per mile when it's loaded. That's a 57-cent margin per mile. Simple enough, but that truck doesn't get to choose where its next load is. After dropping a trailer in, say Phoenix, if there's no return freight lined up, it has to drive 220 miles empty to Tucson just to find its next paying job. Those 220 miles still cost $1.83 per mile in fuel and time, but they generate zero revenue. Suddenly, that 57-cent margin on the paid miles has to absorb the cost of the empty ones, and the real profit per total mile driven collapses to something closer to 11 cents. Now scale that to the real industry. The national average empty mile rate, what's called deadhead, sits around 15% to 20% of all miles driven, on a truck running $105,000 miles a year. That's 15,750 to 21,000 miles of pure cost with no offsetting revenue. At $1.83 per mile in operating cost, that's $28,800 to $38,400 a year bled out before a single load is even factored in. This is why the entire industry is obsessed with something called freight matching and load boards, digital marketplaces where dispatchers hunt in real time for a return load that turns a deadhead run into a paid one. The best run fleets get their deadhead percentage down to 8% to 10% through dedicated lane contracts. Repeatable routes between the same 2 points, like a distribution center and a retail hub, where a truck almost never runs empty because the freight flows in both directions. That's the entire secret to fleet profitability, in one structural fact. It's not about how much you charge per mile. It's about how many of your miles you can force to be paid ones. Layer onto that the fuel mechanism. Diesel represents roughly 20% to 24% of a truck's total operating cost, and fleets hedge this two ways. Fuel surcharges pass to the shipper that adjust weekly based on the DOE's national average diesel price, and bulk fuel contracts locked in at depots along dedicated corridors, sometimes saving 12 to 18 cents a gallon compared to retail pump prices. A 20-truck fleet burning through roughly 800,000 gallons a year can turn an 18-cent per gallon fuel discount into $144,000 of pure margin nobody driving past on the highway will ever see. And here's where the system gets interesting. Because the real machinery of a trucking fleet isn't the trucks. It's the dispatch office. A mid-size fleet typically runs one dispatcher for every 30 to 40 trucks. And that dispatcher's entire job is a live optimization puzzle, matching available trucks to available loads while tracking each driver's remaining hours of service clock down to the minute, because a driver who runs out of legal hours 40 miles from the delivery point turns an on-time load into a missed one. And missed. Appointments trigger detention penalties that can run $50 to $75 per hour the truck sits waiting. Behind the dispatchers sits the maintenance operation, and this is where fleets quietly separate winners from losers. A well-run shop follows a preventive maintenance schedule every 25,000 miles, because an unplanned breakdown on the road doesn't just cost the repair, it costs the load. A blown turbo that strands a truck for 2 days can cost a fleet $3,000 in towing and repair, and another $4,000 to $6,000 in missed freight revenue and penalty fees, all from a part that a 380 preventive service would have caught. Then there's driver retention, the quietest crisis in the entire industry. Large fleet driver turnover averages well above 90% annually, meaning the typical mega carrier effectively has to replace its entire workforce every single year. Recruiting and onboarding one new driver costs a fleet between $8,000 and $12,000 once you factor in advertising, background checks, and training, which means a 500-truck fleet can spend $4 million to $6 million a year purely replacing people who just left, a cost baked so deep into freight rates that shippers never see it as a line item at all. The clearest example of someone who mastered this system is J.B. Hunt Transport, founded in 1961 by Johnny Bryan Hunt, with just 5 trucks and 7 refrigerated trailers hauling poultry out of Arkansas. Hunt's breakthrough wasn't a bigger fleet. It was refusing to run trucks the way everyone else did. In the 1980s, he restructured the entire business around intermodal freight, pairing trucks with rail to slash the deadhead problem at a scale nobody else had attempted, locking dedicated contract lanes with major retailers so trucks almost never ran empty. By the time Hunt took the company public in 1983, it was already generating tens of millions in revenue. Today, J.B. Hunt operates roughly 12,000 trucks and over 100,000 trailers and containers, pulling in more than $12 billion in annual revenue, built from 5 trucks and a bet that solving the empty mile problem was worth more than simply owning more equipment. But here's the part nobody tells you. 2 failure patterns kill smart, experienced trucking operators over and over, regardless of how good they are at the actual job of trucking. The first is over-leverage on equipment during a rate boom. During the 2021 freight surge, spot market rates spiked so high that thousands of new owner-operators financed brand new trucks at $165,000 to $190,000, betting the elevated rates would hold. When spot rates fell nearly 30% to 40% by mid-2022, as freight volumes normalized, many of those same operators were locked into $2,800 to $3,400 monthly truck payments calculated off boom-era revenue projections. And an estimated tens of thousands of owner-operators exited the industry within 18 months, some walking away from trucks now worth 25% less than what they still owed on them. The second pattern is mismanaging insurance risk after a single serious accident. A small fleet with a clean 8-year record and $11,000 per truck annual premiums can see that number jump to $28,000 to $35,000 per truck after one at-fault accident involving injury. And if the fleet can't absorb that overnight tripling of its single largest fixed cost, the operating ratio blows past 100% almost immediately, turning a profitable 15-truck company insolvent within 2 to 3 fiscal quarters, insurance alone accounting for the entire collapse. Then there's the disaster that shook the entire industry, the collapse of Yellow Corporation in 2023. Yellow was one of the oldest and largest less-than-truckload carriers in America, founded in 1924, employing roughly 30,000 people and operating a fleet of over 12,000 tractors and 35,000 trailers at its peak, hauling freight for some of the biggest retailers in the country. Yellow had survived a $700 million federal pandemic relief loan in 2020, survived decades of industry cycles, and carried a debt load that had been building for over a decade following a difficult merger years earlier. But in July 2023, a breakdown in labor negotiations, combined with that crushing debt, triggered a sudden collapse of customer confidence. Shippers, terrified of a strike stranding their freight mid-route, pulled their business almost overnight. Within days, Yellow ceased all operations, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and liquidated a 100-year-old company that had survived the Great Depression, but couldn't survive a debt structure and a labor standoff colliding at the same moment. The single largest trucking bankruptcy in U.S. history, in an industry the whole economy depends on to function. So, here's the resolution to the paradox. Trucking is essential and unforgiving for the exact same reason. The system only produces real, durable profit at scale, and with disciplined debt management over long time horizons. Dedicated lanes, low deadhead miles, hedged fuel, controlled insurance risk. Every operator who skips that discipline in exchange for growing fast during a boom is really just borrowing against a future they can't guarantee. And the system has no mercy for anyone caught holding that bet when the freight cycle turns. Let's run the 2 real scenarios. Scenario 1. The disciplined small fleet. 10 trucks, $1.6 million in equipment financing, generating $2.3 million in annual revenue on dedicated regional lanes. Operating costs, fuel, driver pay, insurance, maintenance, financing, run roughly $2.14 million, leaving net profit around $160,000 a year. At that pace, the fleet pays back its equipment investment in a little over 10 years, but the real return comes from the recurring lane contracts that keep deadhead miles under 10%. Scenario 2. The scaled regional carrier. 200 trucks, roughly $34 million in equipment and infrastructure invested, generating $58 million in annual revenue. Operating costs run around $54.2 million once maintenance shops, dispatch staffing, and insurance are factored in, leaving net profit of roughly $3.8 million a year. A payback period closer to 9 years, but with enough scale to negotiate fuel contracts and insurance rates the 10-truck fleet will never see. Same industry, same highways, same diesel engines. The only thing separating a fleet that survives for decades from one that collapses overnight is how ruthlessly it protects the miles nobody's paying for. That's the system behind every truck you've ever passed on the highway. A machine engineered entirely around the miles you never see it drive. If this broke down a piece of the freight world you didn't know existed, subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, which part of the system surprised you the most?